On the morning of May 24, 2026, Russian Supreme Command issued an assault order that represented the single largest commitment of elite forces in one operational sector since the beginning of the war. 4 units, minus the 1st Guards Tank Army's lead brigade. 2 battalions of Russian airborne forces drawn from the 76th Guards Air Assault Division and a reinforced Special Operations Detachment that Russian military planners had been holding in reserve for 6 weeks specifically for a high-intensity breakthrough operation, were ordered to advance simultaneously along a converging axis northeast of Kramatorsk with the objective of collapsing a Ukrainian defensive salient that Russian operational planning had identified as the critical hinge point of the entire Donetsk front. The operation had been planned for 3 weeks. It had been resourced with priority artillery allocation, dedicated drone suppression coverage, and electronic warfare support that Russian command had stripped from adjacent sectors to concentrate on this single axis. Moscow's planners believed they had assembled an assault package that Ukraine's depleted reserves in the sector simply could not absorb. 6 hours after the assault order was issued, all 4 units had effectively ceased to exist as coherent fighting formations. Not withdrawn, not repulsed, vanished, shattered across a battlefield that Ukraine had spent 3 weeks preparing specifically to receive them. If this is your first time here, and you want the analysis that goes beneath the surface of this war, the doctrine, the systems, the real operational picture that the daily coverage never reaches, hit like and subscribe right now, because this is what this channel is built to deliver. Now let's get into it. The destruction of 4 Russian elite formations in a single 6-hour operational window was not confirmed by Ukrainian official sources alone. Commercial satellite imagery captured the thermal signatures of vehicle kills distributed across a 12-kilometer assault corridor in a pattern consistent with multiple simultaneous ambush engagements rather than a linear defensive battle. Acoustic monitoring data showed a Ukrainian artillery firing pattern that opened simultaneously across 3 separate pre-registered fire zones at the moment Russian forces crossed their line of departure, a signature consistent with a pre-planned fires ambush, rather than a reactive, defensive response. And intercepts of Russian command communications, reviewed by Ukrainian intelligence and summarized in briefings shared with European defense partners, recorded a cascading sequence of unit status reports that moved from assault in progress to heavy contact to communications lost to no status within a window that, for the 76th Guards Air Assault Battalions, was less than 2 hours from first contact to operational dissolution. By the time Russian operational command had assembled a coherent damage assessment, it was looking at the near-total combat ineffectiveness of the most capable force package it had committed to a single operation since the war began. The Kremlin had ordered its best units forward. Hours later, those units had vanished from the operational map, but the destruction of 4 elite formations, as strategically significant as it is, was not the real story. The real story was how Ukraine knew exactly which units were coming, exactly which corridors they would use, and exactly how to build a killing ground so complete that Russia's most capable forces walked into it without a moment of warning. That story goes much deeper than one morning's battle. But the overnight annihilation of Russia's elite assault package was not the real story. The real story was the intelligence and fire system that produced it, and specifically, the fact that Ukraine had known for 18 days that these exact units were coming, had identified the precise assault corridors Russian planners had selected, and had used that 18-day window not to reinforce its defensive line in ways that Russian surveillance would detect, but to covertly construct the most sophisticated multi-layer ambush architecture it had yet deployed in this war. To understand how that was possible, and why Russia's operational security failed so completely against a Ukrainian intelligence system that Moscow believed it had successfully degraded through electronic warfare and drone suppression operations earlier in the spring, you first need to understand the specific collection breakthrough that gave Ukraine its 18-day window, and what Russia did not know it had lost. To understand how Ukraine destroyed Russia's elite units before they had fired a meaningful shot, you first need to understand the signals intelligence development that occurred quietly in the first week of May 2026, and whose operational consequences the May 24th battle made impossible to conceal. Russian military command, responding to the series of Ukrainian intelligence successes that had characterized the spring campaign, the Southern Command communications spoofing, the May 17th deception operation, the Gray Mirror dismantlement had undertaken a systematic operational security review of its planning communications architecture. The review identified what Russian signals security specialists assessed as the primary vulnerability in their planning communications. A pattern of encrypted traffic volume increases between Army-level headquarters and subordinate formations in the 48 to 72 hours before a major operation, which Ukrainian signals intelligence had apparently been using as a pre-assault indicator. The Russian response was to implement a traffic normalization protocol, a system that maintained constant encrypted communications volume between headquarters and subordinate formations regardless of operational tempo. Specifically to deny Ukrainian signals intelligence the volume spike indicator it had been exploiting. The protocol was technically sound. Its implementation, however, required a software update to the encrypted communications terminals used by planning staff at the Army level and below. That update was distributed to affected units between May 3rd and May 7th, and the update package itself, its distribution pattern, the specific terminals it was sent to, the geographic clustering of the units receiving it was observable to Ukrainian signals intelligence assets that were not monitoring communications content, but communications infrastructure activity. Ukraine did not read the assault plan, it read the security upgrade. The units receiving a specific communications security patch in the first week of May were exactly the units being prepared for a high-security operational commitment. Ukraine had its list 18 days before the assault order was issued, and it went to work. The pre-registered artillery fire zones that opened simultaneously the moment Russian forces crossed their line of departure on May 24th are the detail that crystallizes everything about what Ukraine built in those 18 days and why Russia's assault package had no survivable response to what it encountered. Pre-registered fire zones are not improvised. They require survey work, precise measurement of target coordinates, calculation of firing data for every artillery piece. That will engage each zone, physical emplacement of ammunition stocks at the firing positions, and rehearsal of the fire mission sequences so that when the order comes, the fires open within seconds across all zones. Simultaneously, that preparation takes time, requires movement of equipment and ammunition that generates observable signatures, and cannot be concealed indefinitely from Russian surveillance. Ukraine concealed it for 18 days through a combination of methods that, taken together, represent the most disciplined large-scale operational security performance of any Ukrainian military action in this war. Artillery pieces, designated for the ambush fire missions, were moved into their firing positions at night, in small packets dispersed over multiple nights, using routes and movement timings specifically selected to fall below the coverage thresholds of Russian drone surveillance patterns that Ukrainian intelligence had mapped through months of observing Russian ISR flight profiles. Ammunition resupply to those positions was conducted entirely by small, civilian-patterned vehicles, vans and light trucks with no military visual signature, operating on schedules that mimicked normal civilian logistics activity in the area. The pre-registration survey work was performed using passive optical methods and pre-existing topographic data rather than active radar ranging, which would have generated electronic signatures detectable by Russian counter-battery radar and the Ukrainian units that would execute the anti-armor and drone strike. Elements of the ambush were moved into their assault positions in the 48 hours before the battle, using routes and concealment methods that kept them below Russian ground surveillance detection thresholds until the moment the assault began. Russia's surveillance architecture, its drones, its counter-battery radars, its signals intelligence collection, was operating continuously throughout those 18 days and detected none of it. What it saw was a Ukrainian defensive sector that appeared to be thinly held and under-resourced. What was actually there was a killing ground waiting for an order. The full arc of how Russia assembled and committed its elite assault package to the May 24th operation begins in early May, when Russian Operational Command completed an assessment of the Ukrainian defensive salient northeast of Kramatorsk that concluded, based on all available intelligence, that the salient represented a genuine vulnerability, a Ukrainian position that had been held under pressure for 6 weeks, whose supply lines had been repeatedly interdicted, and whose defending units showed the electronic and visual signatures of a formation operating at reduced effectiveness. That assessment was, as has now become a recurring theme in Russian operational planning through the spring of 2026, a picture that Ukraine had carefully constructed for Russian intelligence to find. The salient had indeed been under pressure. The supply interdictions had indeed occurred. The defending units had indeed displayed signatures of reduced effectiveness, but the reduced effectiveness was a performance. The supply interdictions had been absorbed through the dispersed resupply. Methods. Ukraine had been refining since the May 17th operation, and the apparent vulnerability of the salient was the bait. Russian Operational Command, concluding that a decisive made the decision that Ukraine had been engineering it to commit its highest capability reserve forces to a breakthrough operation that would collapse the salient and open the Kramatorsk axis before Ukrainian reserves could be repositioned to respond. The 1st Guards Tank Army Brigade was released from its 6-week reserve commitment. The 76th Guards Air Assault Battalions were tasked from their staging area. The Special Operations Detachment was integrated into the assault plan, and 3 weeks of detailed operational planning produced an assault package that, on paper and by every Russian planning metric, should have succeeded. The planning was thorough, the forces were elite, the resources were concentrated. The one thing Russian planning could not account for was that Ukraine had been reading the preparation for 18 days and had spent every one of those days making the killing ground more complete. Step back now to the full campaign, because the destruction of Russia's elite assault package on May 24th does not stand alone. It is the latest and most devastating operation in a Ukrainian strategic pattern that has been running since the beginning of the spring 2026 campaign, a pattern whose consistent thread is not tactical brilliance in individual engagements but the systematic exploitation of a Russian intelligence failure that has not been corrected despite repeated and costly demonstrations of its consequences. Russia's operational planning has now been catastrophically wrong about Ukrainian force, condition, and intent on the May 17th counteroffensive, on the April 14th Zaporizhia counterattack, and now on the May 24th elite assault commitment. 3 major operations, 3 intelligence failures of the same fundamental type, an inability to distinguish between genuine Ukrainian weakness and deliberately engineered Ukrainian weakness. The pattern is no longer ambiguous. It is, according to analysts at ISW reviewing the accumulating evidence, the defining operational dynamic of the spring 2026 campaign. Ukraine has developed and is consistently executing a deception and ambush methodology against which Russian operational intelligence has not found a reliable counter, and Russia is continuing to commit significant forces to operations whose planning rests on intelligence assessments that Ukraine has specifically constructed to lead Russian planning toward unfavorable decisions. The destruction of 4 elite formations on May 24th is the most expensive single instance of that pattern. It will not be the last unless Russia finds an answer it has not yet demonstrated it possesses. Now come to the arithmetic of what the May 24th losses mean for Russia's operational reserve position through the remainder of the spring and into the summer campaign. The 4 formations committed to the May 24th assault were not frontline attrition units. They were Russia's operational quality reserve. The formations held back from the grinding daily frontline battles specifically to be available for decisive breakthrough operations at moments of genuine opportunity. The 1st Guards Tank Army Brigade represented the highest concentration of modern Russian armor and combined arms capability on the entire eastern axis. The 76th Guards Air Assault Division battalions were among Russia's most experienced and capable rapid response formations, with irreplaceable institutional knowledge and unit cohesion that had been built through years of pre-war training and 4 years of combat experience. The Special Operations Detachment was a resource whose commitment to a single conventional assault operation represented a significant diversion from the covert and deep penetration missions for which it had been trained and equipped. These formations cannot be quickly replaced. Russia can mobilize more soldiers. It cannot quickly reconstitute the unit cohesion, leadership quality, and combined arms competency that the destroyed formations represented. According to defense manpower analysts at RUSI, rebuilding formations of equivalent capability from the surviving cadres and available replacements is a process that takes a minimum of 6 to 9 months under optimal training and equipping conditions that do not exist in a military. Conducting active operations at current tempo, Russia has lost its spring offensive reserve. Its summer campaign will be conducted with whatever second-tier formations can be assembled from the reconstitution pipeline, and the depleted frontline units that have been absorbing attritional losses since February. The operational quality gap between what Russia had available on May 23rd and what it has available on May 25th is not recoverable on the timescale that matters for the 2026 campaign. Here is the final strategic reality that the vanishing of Russia's elite units illuminates. The Russian military entered the spring 2026 campaign with 2 asymmetric advantages it believed were sufficient to sustain offensive momentum, despite the supply chain pressures, the deep strike vulnerabilities, and the covert network disruptions that the preceding months had imposed. The first advantage was mass, the ability to absorb attritional losses at the frontline level while preserving an operational quality reserve that could be committed at decisive moments to achieve breakthrough results that attrition alone could not produce. The second advantage was intelligence, the belief that Russian surveillance and collection systems provided a sufficiently accurate picture of Ukrainian force condition to identify genuine vulnerabilities and time major operations against moments of real Ukrainian weakness. The May 24th operation consumed both advantages simultaneously. The operational quality reserve has been destroyed, and the intelligence system that was supposed to identify genuine Ukrainian vulnerability has now failed at catastrophic cost on 3 consecutive major operations in the same campaign season, against the same fundamental deception method, with losses that grow more severe with each repetition. The old assumption that Russia could husband its best forces until its intelligence identified a genuine breakthrough opportunity and then commit them decisively is finished. There are no more best forces to husband, and the intelligence system that was supposed to find the genuine opportunity has demonstrated 3 times in 8 weeks that it cannot reliably distinguish a genuine opportunity from a trap. What remains is a Russian campaign that must continue with second-tier forces, a degraded supply chain, a compromised, covert infrastructure, and an intelligence architecture whose assessments of Ukrainian force condition carry an uncertainty premium that Russian commanders cannot quantify and cannot plan around. That is not a temporary operational setback. It is a structural condition. And the question it poses for Moscow is not how to recover from May 24th. It is whether a military operating under all of these simultaneous constraints can sustain coherent offensive operations at any meaningful scale through the remainder of 2026, or whether the spring campaign has consumed the last reserves of Russian operational capacity that were keeping the offensive alive. That question does not have a comfortable answer. And in Moscow's planning rooms tonight, the people whose job it is to find one are staring at a map that looks very different from the one they were working from a month ago. What do you think this comes down to? Has the destruction of Russia's elite operational reserve on May 24th, combined with the supply chain failures, the intelligence architecture breakdown, and the covert network disruptions of the spring campaign, pushed the Russian military past the threshold where it can sustain coherent large-scale offensive operations, or does Russia retain enough residual capacity in its mobilization base and defense industrial output to reconstitute and continue, regardless of the quality and tempo losses the spring has imposed? Tell me in the comments. And if this channel is where you come for the real analysis, the systems, the doctrine, the operational picture beneath the daily headlines. Make sure you are subscribed, because the story that is unfolding here is reaching a turning point that nobody should miss.